I'm a reenactor. And for 36 years, I used my hobby on the weekends of historical reenactment to kind of jumpstart my history classes and to lure my students into realizing that history is pretty cool. Well, I'm not in the classroom anymore, but I have garb, a lot of garb, like a room full of garb at home, and I've got to put that to use. I also still have a passion for bringing the past to life, and I have to kind of retool myself. So what I've been doing since I got out of the classroom is I decided I would explore parts of history that I didn't get a chance to because, being limited by my curriculum. So I've become really involved in looking at California history, especially the 18th and 19th centuries, and to tell the stories of various places and the various events and do it as a reenactor. So at first I followed the missions and the presidios and the assistencias and told the tales of each of these places in garb, and I did the same for Russian California. And then I stumbled across banditos and lawmen, and I've been following that. But there was something that kind of was a thread through most of the missions that I was looking at, and that was the Mexican War. So what I've decided to do is look at the Mexican War in California, and I hope you stick with me on this journey. What better place to begin or look at the Mexican War in California than at the home of Pico, who was the last Mexican governor of Alta California. Spain and Mexico later on would have troubled relations with the United States. I guess that's why we're talking about the Mexican War. And as far as California was concerned, or Alta California was concerned, Spain didn't want Alta California dealing with the outside world. It was to depend upon that one ship and show up once a year and bring whatever trade items were necessary to sustain the territory. But that sort of a situation ended up creating an atmosphere where smuggling took place. And there were always Yankee traders that were very eager to buy the leather hides, California dollars, and to buy the tallow. The situation is going to be different in Texas. In Texas, because Spain was desperate to populate the area, they allowed some American immigration to take place. And later, when Mexico achieved its independence, Mexico still encouraged the immigration. And by 1835, there were about probably 20,000 Americans, including some Cherokee, as opposed to 5,000 Mexicans. Now, Mexico did not mind foreigners showing up. They did plenty of business with Yankee traders once Mexico achieved its independence from Spain. And in fact, in 1828, they built the custom house here in Monterey as kind of a symbol of that. They were welcoming trade. They didn't mind Americans showing up by sea. However, when Jedediah Smith showed up twice in California by land and was arrested twice and let go twice, Mexico envisioned a whole flood of Americans heading west, following Manifest Destiny, and they weren't really looking forward to dealing with that. So at first, Mexico looked at Americans coming in and becoming citizens and adopting the Catholic faith as a good way to consolidate control of Texas. But in time, they started to doubt the loyalty of the Texans and Tejanos, and the Texans in turn were resentful because they thought they didn't have much representation in Mexico's government. In 1834, when General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna assumes the presidency and revokes the Constitution of 1824, now the Texans are really upset, and they end up declaring independence, and that's where you get into the whole Alamo thing. And eventually what's going to happen is the Texans will be successful and will become independent, and which is something that Mexico disputes. And Mexico, by the way, will say Texas is about this big. The Texans, who are now independent, say Texas is this big. And there's also going to be problems as far as the United States wants to control the entire continent. They want to do the whole Manifest Destiny thing, and they want to kind of squeeze out Britain, and they want to squeeze out France from getting any more territory. But Mexico is not going to recognize that Texan independence thing, and what's also happening is they don't have the resources, they have internal struggles, they don't have the money to reinforce their claim to the area. Before the Mexican War, Mexico had 5 presidios in place. 4 had been built by Spain. 3 of those guarded important harbors and had additional installations. El Presidio de San Diego, located atop a hill above the growing pueblo, had Castillo de Guajaros, or Fort Cobblestones, built in 1797 on Ballast Point, as the first defensive fortifications for San Diego Bay. Monterey had El Castillo de Monterey, and the Spanish had built El Castillo de San Joaquin, where Fort Point is now, and Batteria San Jose to help the Presidio San Francisco guard the bay. El Presidio de Santa Barbara had no such castillo nor batteria. And by 1840, San Diego was a pueblo, not a military town. The Presidio of Santa Barbara was in partial ruin. The Presidio Chapel in Monterey was the only building still in use. And San Francisco's Presidio, Castillo, and Batteria were pretty much neglected. Even the new barracks at Sonoma, a collection of guardhouses, storerooms, living quarters, and an observation tower, erected in 1836 by General Vallejo, was operated by civilians, sort of a militia or a National Guard. But there would be a prelude to war, or a trial run, and it would involve the Castillo of Monterey. What's going to end up happening, I guess, is the Castillo had gotten really cleaned up and reinforced, and the guns were in good condition. And the United States and Mexico were kind of grumbling at each other, and there was a Commodore named Jones who was in charge of the Western Squadron, who was told to be prepared that if is the big word here, if the United States and Mexico enter hostilities, he was to seize control of Monterey. Now, in October of 1842, I guess that if got ignored, and Commodore Jones sent troops in, and there was a party that went up to El Castillo. They marched about something like 400 yards or 400 feet, and they're marching 6 abreast up to the Castillo, and they noticed there were cannons pointed at them, and the cannons were loaded. They were all set to go, and there were soldados with smoking matches there, and for some reason the Mexican forces chose not to defend El Castillo, and Governor Alvarado was given, well, not much of a choice. He was told to surrender. And the governor did so. And the next day, the truth came out. And Jones kind of looked at his orders that if there's hostilities, he was to attack. Well, there weren't hostilities yet. Those would be about 4 years in the future. So what Jones had done is he had invaded a sovereign nation and kind of had to backpedal. Sorry, but they'll have a chance to have a do-over in 4 years. So Jones's war in Monterey ended peacefully enough. But tensions are still building between the two countries, pushing them towards war. And in February of 1845, Congress passes a joint resolution to formally annex Texas. By the way, in that same February, on February 22nd, Pico is going to be appointed governor. This will be his second time being governor. Well, technically the first time he was governor pro tem, and he had begun the secularization process of the missions. He's going to finish that as governor. In October of 1845, the people of Texas agreed to the annexation of Texas by the United States. By December, Texas is part of the Union, which is going to cause more problems with Mexico. And now there's going to be skirmishing back and forth. Now, this is a prelude to the Mexican War, and it's going to take place just a few miles from Mission San Juan Bautista. John C. Fremont and his party of U.S. surveyors, and that was, the air quotes are there for a reason, were allowed to winter in California as long as they had followed an agreement to stay away from the coast. Apparently the Mexican government did not really want them having very accurate surveys of that area. They didn't want them to have too much information. Well, Fremont didn't do that. There were reports that he and his men were spotted in the hills near Monterey, and they were ordered to leave California. Well, what they did instead is they retreated up to Gavilan Hill or Gavilan Peak. And what they ended up doing is they built a fortification up there, and there were some attempts at diplomacy and maybe some not so diplomatic words that were bandied back and forth, and then Fremont grudgingly left. But he'd be back. War is coming to Alta California. Okay, well, that's the setup for the Mexican War in California. Now we're going to actually get to the war in the next film. I hope you stick with me.